They came from the ruins of the Soviet Empire, not with guns, but with genius. Infiltrating banks, cities, and governments, they turned corruption into an art form. This is the untold story of how the Russian Mafia conquered America from within. If you crave the truth behind hidden power, secret empires, and money that never sleeps, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history, it's the world you're living in. When the Iron Curtain began to crack, few in the West understood what was about to spill through the fissures. Behind the official narratives of dissidents, artists, and dreamers seeking freedom, another kind of traveler prepared his journey. These were men forged in the underbelly of the Soviet Union, smugglers, black marketeers, thieves who had survived under the grey brutality of a totalitarian system where scarcity bred ingenuity and corruption was a second language. Their departure would transform not just their lives, but the criminal landscape of the United States itself. To understand the rise of the Russian Mafia in America, one must return to the final decades of the USSR, when the state's iron control had begun to corrode. In the post-Stalin years, the black market became both a lifeline and a moral school. Under the shadow of the hammer and sickle, entire underground economies flourished, trading in forbidden goods, Western currency, and influence. The term blat, a word that roughly means connections, defined the essence of survival. Those who mastered it could get anything: meat, jeans, even freedom. But some took it further. They didn't just bend the rules, they built empires in the cracks of a collapsing order. By the 1970s, the Soviet regime reluctantly allowed waves of Jewish immigrants to leave for Israel or the United States. Within those flows, hidden among legitimate families seeking safety, came experienced criminals who saw America as a new frontier. They carried with them the traditions of the Soviet underworld, the Vorovskoy Mir, the thieves' world, a parallel society ruled by its own code of honor, where betrayal was punishable by death and respect was earned through violence and cunning. The first major settlements formed in Brooklyn, New York, particularly in the neighborhood of Brighton Beach. To outsiders, it looked like an immigrant success story. Small stores, Russian restaurants, Orthodox synagogues, and old men playing chess on the boardwalk. But beneath the nostalgic facade, something darker was taking shape. According to FBI files and later investigations by journalists, including Robert I. Friedman in his book Red Mafia, Brighton Beach quickly became the headquarters of a new breed of organized crime, one that combined Soviet ruthlessness with Western opportunity. In those early years, the Russian gangs were not united. They were fragmented, composed of small groups led by men with military or prison backgrounds, but they shared one instinct: exploitation of the system's blind spots. America in the 1980s had little understanding of post-Soviet crime structures. Law enforcement officers didn't speak Russian, didn't recognize the tattoos that marked rank among the Vori v Zakone, and often mistook them for petty hustlers. That ignorance became the criminals' shield. Their first enterprises were simple but effective. Many began with insurance fraud, food stamp scams, and auto theft rings. Others smuggled stolen art, weapons, or pharmaceuticals from the collapsing Eastern Bloc. But soon, their operations evolved. The Russians understood that in a capitalist society, the real money flowed not from the streets, but from the banks. They started laundering funds through shell companies, using legitimate-looking import-export businesses as camouflage. Documentaries such as The Red Mafia, a legacy of the Soviet underworld, detail how the first Russian crime bosses learned to exploit American bureaucracy. In the Soviet Union, bribery was an art form, but in the US, the Russians discovered that money could achieve the same ends through lobbying, donations, and corporate fronting. What had once been corruption became business. Their transition was helped by timing. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the USSR flooded the world with ex-KGB agents, soldiers, and bureaucrats who had lost their power but kept their skills. Many of them moved west, joining or assisting criminal groups abroad. The result was a fusion of intelligence expertise, military discipline, and criminal ambition unlike anything America had faced before. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, US intelligence agencies began noticing strange financial patterns. Large sums moving from Russia through American banks, mysterious real estate purchases in New York and Miami, and shell corporations with Slavic names popping up overnight. At the same time, violent incidents began to rise within Russian communities. Kidnappings, extortions, and contract killings that bore the signature of professional Bratva brotherhood operations. The Russian Mafia's early American phase was not about domination, but infiltration. Their goal was not to take over the streets already ruled by Italian, Irish, or Hispanic gangs, but to penetrate the financial veins of the system. They preferred silence to spectacle, deception to bloodshed. Unlike the flamboyant dons of the Gambino family, Russian bosses operated from the shadows, often through legitimate business fronts. A car dealership could be a cover for arms smuggling. A small import company could hide millions in laundered cash. Yet, the real genius of the Russian underworld was its ability to adapt. The American criminal environment rewarded innovation, and these men, trained under one of the most oppressive regimes on earth, were masters of adaptation. They knew how to work under surveillance, how to forge documents, how to manipulate bureaucracies. To them, America was not a fortress, but a playground of opportunities protected by laws that criminals could learn to exploit better than anyone else. Law enforcement struggled to respond. Traditional methods used against the Italian mafia, such as infiltration through undercover agents, failed repeatedly. The Russians were paranoid, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to their codes. They used language as a weapon. Conversations in coded Russian slang, or fenya, baffled translators. Even when arrested, few witnesses dared to testify. The FBI realized that the enemy they faced was not a gang. It was an imported system. By the end of the 1990s, what began as scattered groups of immigrants had become a transnational network with roots across the United States. From the poker dens of Brighton Beach to the nightclubs of Los Angeles and the docks of Miami, the Russian Mafia had established itself as an invisible force. Its rise was not sudden but patient, fueled by greed and intelligence, shaped by the ghosts of the Soviet past and the temptations of Western capitalism. It was, in many ways, the perfect crime story of the 20th century. A group of men born under communism who used capitalism itself as their greatest weapon. They came from the shadows of Moscow and Odessa, not waving guns but holding ledgers, passports, and contracts. They didn't conquer America through violence, they seduced it through opportunity. And before anyone realized it, the Russian underworld had found a new home on American soil. Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, looked ordinary at first glance. A narrow stretch along the Atlantic, filled with grocery stores displaying Cyrillic letters, small restaurants serving borscht and pelmeni, and grandmothers pushing strollers along the boardwalk. To most New Yorkers in the 1970s and 80s, it was simply Little Odessa, a neighborhood where Soviet émigrés rebuilt their lives, clinging to fragments of the homeland they had left behind. But behind that nostalgic facade, in the smoky back rooms of cafes and in the basements beneath Russian bathhouses, a new empire was taking shape, one that would soon become synonymous with the term Russian Mafia. The story of Little Odessa's transformation into a criminal capital began with chaos, the kind of chaos only history can create. When the Soviet Union loosened its emigration policies, tens of thousands of people fled. Many were scientists, engineers, and artists seeking freedom. But mixed within that crowd were hardened criminals, professional smugglers, and former Soviet soldiers who knew that the streets of America offered not just liberty, but wealth and anonymity. The first wave of Russian gangsters in Brighton Beach did not resemble the stereotypical mafia figures Americans were used to. They didn't wear fine suits or speak in coded Italian phrases. They were quieter, rougher, and infinitely more pragmatic. They came from the Soviet criminal tradition known as the vori v zakone, thieves in law, a caste of elite criminals whose roots went back to the brutal labor camps of Stalin's Gulag. In those camps, the vori had developed their own language, rituals, and tattoos that recorded every detail of their criminal biography. Each star, cross, or cathedral etched into their skin was a resume of crimes and time served. When they arrived in New York, they brought this culture with them. And they found fertile ground. Unlike traditional American mafias, the Russians did not seek control through territories, but through systems. In Brighton Beach, they saw a community isolated by language, nostalgia, and distrust of authority. Many Russian immigrants avoided police and government institutions, having grown up under regimes where both were synonymous with oppression. That distrust created the perfect environment for criminal protection networks. A restaurant owner or taxi driver, threatened by petty thieves or rival gangs, had nowhere to turn, except to the local pakan, the boss. By the early 1980s, several such bosses had emerged. One of the first was Evsey Agron, a Ukrainian-born extortionist who ruled Brighton Beach like a feudal lord. Agron had arrived in the US in 1975 and quickly built a reputation for brutality and cunning. He ran protection rackets on every business in the neighborhood, extracting payments in exchange for security. His men patrolled the streets, collecting envelopes stuffed with cash, ensuring that those who paid were left alone and those who didn't were reminded of their mistake. The FBI would later describe Agron's organization as a mafia within an ethnic enclave, but it was far more complex than that. He operated less like an American mobster and more like a Soviet commissar. He maintained alliances with other émigré criminals, brokers, and even certain corrupt officials. And though his empire was built on fear, it was also built on familiarity. Many immigrants saw him not as a criminal, but as a necessary evil, a man who could solve problems that American institutions could not. Agron's reign, however, was short-lived. In 1985, he was shot twice in the head outside his home, killed by a rival faction. His murder opened the floodgates. Into the power vacuum stepped Marat Balagula, a former accountant from Odessa, whose intelligence and sophistication marked a new chapter in Russian-American organized crime. Balagula understood that violence drew attention, and attention was bad for business. Instead of running street rackets, he built an empire of white-collar crime. Balagula's specialty was fuel tax fraud, a complex scheme that allowed his network to siphon millions of dollars from federal and state governments by manipulating the system of gasoline distribution. At the height of his power, he controlled one of the largest fuel distribution rings in the US, reportedly generating more than $1 billion in illegal profits. The operation was so intricate that FBI agents later admitted they had underestimated its scale for years. But Balagula was not just a businessman, he was a visionary. He realized that the Russian Mafia's strength lay in its invisibility, in blending the old criminal codes with new financial sophistication. He built connections with the Italian Mafia, particularly the Gambino family, negotiating business arrangements that blurred ethnic lines. For the first time, the Russians were recognized not as crude outsiders, but as equal partners in organized crime. The nickname Little Odessa soon carried a double meaning. It referred not just to the nostalgic memory of the Ukrainian port city, but also to a new criminal capital that mirrored the underworld of the old country. The streets of Brighton Beach became an open secret among law enforcement, a place where drug deals, extortions, and arms trades could happen in broad daylight under the guise of legitimate business. Bars and restaurants became meeting points for men who carried themselves with military precision and spoke in low-coded Russian. Journalists who ventured into the neighborhood often reported a strange duality. the surface calm of immigrant life, and beneath it, whispers of murder and money. Robert the Sir Friedman, who spent years investigating the Russian underworld for his book Red Mafia, described Brighton Beach as a criminal state within a state. According to his research, by the late 1980s, the Russian Mafia had spread far beyond Brooklyn. They had reached Miami, Los Angeles, and even parts of Chicago, following the paths of émigré communities and exploiting every gap in local law enforcement knowledge. What made the Russian Mafia particularly dangerous was its adaptability. They did not replicate the rigid hierarchies of the Italian Cosa Nostra. Instead, they operated through loose, shifting alliances. A brigade in Brooklyn could work independently while maintaining ties to networks in Moscow or Odessa. This fluid structure made them harder to track, harder to dismantle, and far more resilient. By the early 1990s, the term Russian Mafia had entered American popular culture. Hollywood films began portraying mysterious, cold-blooded men with thick accents and gold chains, while the media sensationalized their supposed connections to international espionage. But behind the stereotype was a real power, a shadow network of businessmen, killers, and former Soviet officials who had learned to navigate both sides of the law. Little Odessa had become more than a neighborhood. It was a symbol of a new kind of organized crime, one born in the ashes of communism and thriving in the chaos of capitalism. From its narrow streets, the Russian Mafia would launch its next phase, expansion across the United States, merging the brutality of the Soviet underworld with the sophistication of Wall Street. What began with a few immigrants in Brighton Beach would soon grow into a national phenomenon, one that law enforcement would spend decades trying to understand, and even longer trying to stop. By the early 1990s, the Russian Mafia in America had become something far more complex than a street-level criminal group. It was an organism, fluid, intelligent, and almost impossible to dissect. What law enforcement once tried to label as the Russian mob was in reality a constellation of independent but interconnected networks, each governed by an ancient code that predated the Cold War itself. To understand how it operated, one must look at the code of the Wor v Zakone, the thief in law, and how this centuries-old criminal tradition mutated in the American environment. The Wor v Zakone emerged from the dark heart of Stalin's gulags. In the early 20th century, when millions were imprisoned in Siberian camps, professional criminals created their own society within the barbed wire. It was a world without state authority, where power was earned through reputation, ruthlessness, and a strict moral code that rejected all cooperation with the government. The Vior, or thief, lived by a law that was both brutal and strangely idealistic. Steal but never work, help fellow thieves, betray no one, and never serve authority. In the chaos of Soviet oppression, the Vori became a shadow aristocracy, outlaws who ruled the underworld with ritual, tattoo, and silence. When these men and their disciples arrived in the United States, they brought that legacy with them. But America was not a prison camp, it was a marketplace, and that forced the code to evolve. In Brighton Beach, Los Angeles, Miami, and Chicago, the old rules began to bend. Some Vori abandoned the romanticized notion of the honorable thief and embraced what one FBI report later called a pragmatic hybrid between ideology and profit. This hybridization was the key to their survival. While the Italian Mafia relied on hierarchy, with its godfathers, capos, and soldiers, the Russian criminal system was decentralized. It worked through trust, reputation, and personal networks that could stretch across oceans. The result was a spiderweb of semi-autonomous cells, each capable of operating independently while maintaining loyalty to the broader criminal fraternity. This adaptability made the Russian Mafia uniquely resilient. If one leader was arrested or killed, another could seamlessly take his place with no interruption in the flow of money or operations. Federal investigations throughout the 1990s revealed that these groups were not strictly Russian. They included Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and even Chechens, a true post-Soviet mosaic. The American media lumped them all under the term Russian Mafia, but insiders preferred the word Bratva, brotherhood. The Bratva was less an organization than an ecosystem, an informal confederation of criminals bound by shared origins, mutual benefit, and the silent authority of the Vori. Within this network, leadership operated on two levels. The first was symbolic, the old-school Vor v Zakone, men who maintained the illusion of the traditional criminal code. They were respected as spiritual figures, keepers of the underworld's mythology. The second level was practical. The businessmen, smugglers, and financiers who controlled operations across continents. A VOR in Moscow might give his blessing to an operation in New York, but the actual logistics would be handled by mid-level operators, each responsible for a segment of the pipeline: money laundering, narcotics, cybercrime, arms trafficking, or extortion. One of the most striking features of the Russian Mafia's organizational evolution was its seamless blending of the old and the new. In interviews collected by criminologists such as Mark Galeotti, whose book The Vori, Russia's Super Mafia, remains one of the definitive studies, former members described how ritualistic prison tattoos coexisted with modern financial sophistication. A man with a cathedral tattoo on his chest, symbolizing years spent in Soviet prisons, might also own a luxury condominium in Manhattan, a shipping company registered in Cyprus, and offshore accounts in the Caribbean. Tradition and technology moved hand in hand. American law enforcement struggled to adapt. In the case of the Italian Mafia, investigators had spent decades perfecting strategies like wiretapping, infiltration, and RICO prosecutions. But these tools were less effective against the Russians. Their structure defied the clear hierarchies that RICO laws depended on. There was no central leadership, no single family, no written rules, only fluid alliances. The FBI would later describe the Russian networks as horizontal criminal enterprises, where collaboration was temporary, profit-driven, and often international. This loose structure also gave the Bratva a distinct advantage: plausible deniability. A businessman laundering money for a Russian syndicate in New York could claim ignorance of its criminal origin. A smuggler in Odessa could sell weapons to an American partner without ever meeting him. Paper trails were fragmented by design, and transactions passed through layers of intermediaries, offshore companies, and corrupt officials. Even when law enforcement traced the money, they found themselves navigating a labyrinth where legality and criminality overlapped so perfectly that it became almost impossible to separate them. Yet, despite this sophistication, the Vori never lost their sense of ritual. Meetings were still held in secrecy, often in bathhouses or private apartments, where cigarettes burned down to ash and toasts were made to the brotherhood. Before major decisions, oaths were taken, and disputes were settled according to Vorovskoy's Zakon, the thieves' law. Punishments were brutal but swift. Betrayal, especially cooperation with authorities, remained the ultimate sin. In this way, even as they embraced capitalism, the Russian criminals maintained a cultural continuity with their Gulag ancestors. One of the paradoxes of this system was its moral duality. Inside the underworld, loyalty and honor were sacred. Outside it, deceit and violence were tools of survival. Many Vori justified their actions by claiming they were simply continuing the rebellion against oppressive systems, whether Soviet communism or Western capitalism. In their worldview, they were not villains but survivors, men who had learned that all systems were corrupt and that power, not justice, ruled the world. Documentaries produced by PBS and the BBC in the 2000s highlighted this ideological layer, showing how the Russian Mafia's structure blurred the line between political corruption and organized crime. Many former Soviet officials, stripped of their positions after the USSR's collapse, joined or supported these networks. They brought with them knowledge of intelligence operations, logistics, and global finance, effectively militarizing organized crime. What emerged was something entirely new, a hybrid structure where criminal enterprises functioned with the efficiency of intelligence agencies. By the late 1990s, the Russian Mafia had become one of the most globally integrated crime systems on Earth. In the United States, their networks extended into cybercrime, human trafficking, securities fraud, and high-end theft rings. They invested in nightclubs, construction firms, and tech startups. FBI analysts noted that while Italian and Colombian syndicates were declining under government pressure, the Russians were expanding, not by taking over, but by embedding themselves inside legitimate markets. The code of the VORV Zakony had evolved, but its essence remained: silence, loyalty, and profit. The tattoos might now be hidden under tailored suits, the meetings held in luxury apartments instead of dim basements, but the spirit of the old Soviet underworld still pulsed beneath the surface. The Vori had not just survived exile, they had reinvented it. By merging the traditions of the Gulag with the technologies of globalization, the Russian Mafia achieved what few other criminal systems had ever managed: the transformation of an ancient brotherhood into a modern transnational corporation of crime. It was no longer just a story of immigrants in Brighton Beach. It was the beginning of a global network that would soon manipulate economies, influence politics, and redefine the meaning of organized power in the post-Cold War world. By the mid-1990s, the Russian Mafia had learned an old truth about America: that true power didn't lie in the streets, but in the markets. Guns could buy fear, but money bought invisibility. And while police in New York and Los Angeles still chased kidnappers, extortionists, and smugglers, the real architects of the Russian underworld had moved into offices, banks, and boardrooms. They traded violence for financial sophistication, and their empire began to grow, silently, exponentially, and globally. To understand this transformation, you must imagine a system that functions like a vast, untraceable river. Every dollar that entered this river, stolen through fraud, bribery, drug sales, or government corruption, would travel thousands of miles, passing through layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, and complicit bankers, until it finally emerged clean on the other side. This was not laundering in the traditional sense. It was industrialized purification, a criminal innovation that would later be known as the Russian laundromat. The origins of this financial revolution trace back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. When communism fell, trillions of rubles in state assets were suddenly up for grabs. Oil companies, mining conglomerates, and factories were privatized overnight. In the chaos, former bureaucrats, intelligence agents, and criminal bosses merged into what one investigative journalist called the new oligarchy of crime. These men, many with connections to the Bratva in the US, needed a place to store and move their fortunes, and no country offered a safer, more discreet environment than the United States. The Russian Mafia's mastery of money laundering began with small-scale operations in the 1980s, fake insurance claims, tax evasion through gas stations, and import-export fraud. But by the 1990s, their methods had become far more sophisticated. They created shell corporations in Delaware, Panama, and the Cayman Islands, using lawyers and accountants who never asked questions. They funneled illicit profits from Russia and Eastern Europe into American real estate, stock markets, and luxury goods. One of the most infamous examples came to light in 1999, when US investigators uncovered a massive money laundering operation involving the Bank of New York. Over $7 billion in Russian funds had been secretly transferred through the institution, routed through accounts controlled by Russian businessmen and mob figures. The case revealed just how deeply criminal money had penetrated the Western financial system. Federal agents traced the funds back to networks tied to the Solntsevskaya Bratva, one of Russia's largest crime syndicates, and to corrupt officials in Moscow. But the most shocking revelation wasn't the amount of money. It was how easily it had passed through the system, unnoticed for years. According to court documents and reports from the US Treasury, the Russian laundromat used a formula that would later become a model for transnational crime. It began with seed money from illicit activities, drug trafficking, weapons deals, or state asset theft. The money would first move to an offshore shell company registered in a secrecy jurisdiction like Cyprus or the British Virgin Islands. From there, it was sent to another company in Europe, often disguised as a loan or investment. Once it passed through several layers of legitimate financial institutions, it entered the US as clean capital. The cycle could involve dozens of transactions, hundreds of companies, and countless forged documents. Documentaries like Frontline, The Russian Laundromat, and Inside the World's Greatest Money Laundering Machine reveal how this process wasn't limited to criminal enterprises. Politicians, oligarchs, and corporate executives all participated, each hiding their money under the same veil of secrecy. In some cases, Russian Mafia networks partnered with Western financiers, merging crime with capitalism in a way that blurred all moral distinctions. In New York, Miami, and Los Angeles, this invisible empire began to reshape the landscape. Entire blocks of luxury real estate were purchased in cash through anonymous LLCs. High-end art auctions became convenient vehicles for transferring millions without scrutiny. Nightclubs, casinos, and import businesses acted as fronts for money movement. A glass of champagne poured on a Manhattan rooftop could represent the final stage of a laundering operation that had begun in the ruins of a Russian steel plant. The irony was devastating. The same system designed to promote economic freedom had become the perfect shelter for transnational crime. Investigators later noted that the Russian Mafia didn't invade America, it invested in it. Its greatest achievement was not in violence, but in invisibility. By the early 2000s, federal agencies such as the FBI and FinCEN began mapping the full scale of Russian financial infiltration. They discovered networks that linked New York brokers to offshore banks in Latvia, Cyprus, and the Isle of Man. Some of these networks were so complex that even after years of investigation, the origins of the funds remained uncertain. One high-ranking US Treasury official famously remarked, "We know the money is dirty, we just can't prove where it got the dirt." And as the years passed, the Russian Mafia's financial architecture evolved alongside global technology. When the internet became central to commerce, the Bratva adapted instantly. Cybercrime, identity theft, and credit card fraud became major income sources. Hackers from St. Petersburg or Kiev could steal millions from American banks without ever setting foot on US soil. Those digital profits then entered the same laundering channels, offshore accounts, real estate, and shell corporations, making them indistinguishable from legitimate investments. At its core, this transformation marked the Russian Mafia's metamorphosis from an underworld of violence to a global economic power. The modern Bratva operated more like a corporation than a gang. It employed financial advisors, IT specialists, lawyers, and even public relations experts. It maintained offices in New York, Moscow, Tel Aviv, and London. In some cases, it held stakes in companies traded on the stock market. Yet, despite its sophistication, the mafia never abandoned its roots. Behind the polished fronts and offshore accounts, old-world brutality remained the ultimate enforcer. If a business partner failed to deliver, if an insider threatened exposure, the punishment was still primitive and final. Bodies appeared in rivers, car bombs exploded in parking lots, and witnesses vanished. Violence remained the grammar of trust in a world built on deceit. The global reach of the Russian Mafia's financial operations stunned even veteran investigators. In 2017, a European consortium of journalists uncovered the global laundromat, a system that moved more than $20 billion from Russia through Western banks. American subsidiaries were among the beneficiaries. The investigation confirmed what many already suspected. The Russian Mafia had become inseparable from the global economy. Its money flowed through the same veins that powered Wall Street and London's financial districts. In this new reality, the difference between a gangster and a businessman was often only a matter of paperwork. A corporation that financed real estate in Manhattan might unknowingly be a laundering front for a Russian syndicate. A hedge fund that invested in Eastern European energy projects might be silently owned by men who once smuggled weapons out of Chechnya. The underworld had gone corporate, and capitalism itself had become its camouflage. By the time law enforcement began to understand the scale of what was happening, the damage was done. Billions had already been washed through the American economy. Skyscrapers, nightclubs, and luxury brands stood as silent monuments to this invisible conquest. The Russian Mafia no longer needed to control neighborhoods. It controlled assets, influence, and the very perception of legitimacy. Money, once the servant of crime, had become its ultimate weapon. And in that weapon's shadow, the line between criminal and capitalist dissolved, leaving behind a truth as chilling as it was undeniable. The Russian Mafia had mastered America not by breaking its laws, but by mastering them. Violence for the Russian Mafia was never just a tool, it was a language. And like any language, it had grammar, rhythm, and purpose. In the American underworld, where the Italian mafia once ruled through ritualized intimidation and the Colombian cartels through terror, the Russians brought something colder, a philosophy of fear refined over generations of survival in the Soviet underground. To them, violence was not chaos, it was order. It was communication through pain, designed to send messages without words and to command obedience without negotiation. By the early 1990s, after years of quiet infiltration, Russian criminal groups operating in the United States began to display a distinctive signature in their acts of enforcement. Gone were the predictable warnings of traditional mobsters, the broken legs, the smashed cars. The Russians favored efficiency and finality. When they needed to make a point, someone simply vanished. When they needed to prove control, a body appeared, staged, brutalized, left in a way that spoke volumes to those who understood the code. Law enforcement soon learned that the Bratva did not believe in second chances. Investigators described the first wave of Russian contract killings in the US as surgical. No witnesses, no noise, no trace. One of the earliest high-profile cases was the 1985 assassination of Evsei Agron, the self-proclaimed godfather of Brighton Beach. He was shot twice in the head with a silenced pistol outside his Brooklyn apartment, execution style. His death, believed to be ordered by his protégé Marat Balagula, marked the beginning of an era in which violence within the Russian criminal world followed the logic of corporate succession. Leadership replaced through murder rather than retirement. Unlike the Italian Mafia, which often wrapped its violence in ceremony and symbolism, the Russian Mafia treated killing as an administrative act. The hitmen, often ex-KGB agents, Afghan war veterans, or former members of Soviet special forces, brought a level of professionalism rarely seen in the American criminal landscape. They were disciplined, emotionless, and precise. Their loyalty was not to ideology, but to contracts, and they operated with the detached efficiency of soldiers carrying out orders on a battlefield. Law enforcement nicknamed them ghost killers. They left behind no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no trails. Ballistic forensics often turned up nothing, and even when suspects were identified, fear silenced every potential witness. In some cases, entire families disappeared. An FBI agent assigned to Russian organized crime in New York later admitted, "We were dealing with men who had survived gulags, wars, and revolutions. Killing someone in Brooklyn was nothing to them." The violence extended far beyond personal rivalries. It became a mechanism of business regulation. When the Russian Mafia expanded into arms trafficking, drug smuggling, and money laundering, disputes were inevitable. There were no courts, no contracts that could be enforced by law, only bullets. Disloyal partners, informants, or competitors were dealt with through what insiders called uravnilovka, equalization. The term came from Soviet prison slang, meaning to make things even. In practice, it meant death. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, contract killings linked to Russian networks occurred across the United States, from New York to Miami to Los Angeles. But the phenomenon was not confined to America. As the Russian Mafia globalized, its assassins followed. In London, Berlin, Vienna, and Dubai, businessmen tied to Russian crime or politics died under mysterious circumstances: car crashes, sudden illnesses, apparent suicides. Western intelligence agencies began to suspect that these deaths were not isolated incidents, but part of a coordinated pattern. The lines between organized crime, business, and state intelligence blurred until they were nearly indistinguishable. This fusion of criminal and political violence was not accidental. Many Russian mobsters of the post-Soviet generation had close ties to former intelligence officers. The same men who once handled espionage during the Cold War now ran private security companies, smuggling operations, or consulting firms that doubled as fronts for assassination squads. As Mark Galeotti, one of the foremost experts on Russian organized crime, noted, "The Russian Mafia is not a mafia in the traditional sense. It's a networked ecosystem, one where businessmen, gangsters, and agents coexist in a gray zone of shared interests. In this ecosystem, intimidation was as valuable as murder. Business owners in Brighton Beach, Miami, and Chicago lived under the constant threat of reprisal. Even rumors of disobedience could trigger consequences. Victims would receive phone calls at odd hours, a quiet voice reminding them that friends from Odessa or brothers from Moscow were watching. Sometimes an empty envelope would arrive in the mail, sealed with nothing inside. It meant, "We know where you are." No need for shouting, no need for proof. Just silence and certainty. The use of terror extended to the global stage. Journalists who investigated the connections between Russian oligarchs, crime networks, and politics often met grim fates. In Moscow, reporters like Anna Politkovskaya and Yuri Shekochikin exposed the deadly intersections of business and the underworld, only to end up poisoned or shot. In Western Europe, Russian businessmen with knowledge of money laundering operations died mysteriously in hotel rooms or fell from balconies. These killings were not random acts of revenge. They were warnings written in blood, messages to anyone who dared to unveil the machinery of corruption. In the United States, law enforcement found itself trapped between two worlds, the visible and the invisible. They could track drug shipments, intercept smuggled weapons, and identify fake documents, but they could not always see the hand that pulled the trigger. The Russian Mafia's violence was global, detached from geography, and often executed by intermediaries who disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Even as the Mafia became increasingly sophisticated, laundering billions through American banks and investing in real estate, violence remained the foundation of its authority. The appearance of civility was just a mask. Beneath the luxury cars and glass offices, the Bratva still functioned as a fraternity of predators. In their world, fear was not a side effect of violence. It was its currency. By the 2010s, the reach of Russian criminal violence had extended into the digital age. Cyber intimidation became the new frontier. Hackers not only stole money, but also threatened lives. Emails with death threats, blackmail videos, and data leaks replaced bullets, though the end result was the same: silence, compliance, submission. In one documented case, an American businessman who tried to expose a Russian laundering scheme received a simple message on his phone: "We don't need to find you. We already have." He fled the country 2 days later. Violence, whether physical or psychological, remained the essence of the Bratva's control. It wasn't the chaos of street gangs, but a chilling order, a disciplined hierarchy of fear passed down from the Soviet camps to the skyscrapers of Manhattan. To the Russian Mafia, killing was not just punishment, it was punctuation. Every act of bloodshed closed a sentence in a story written across decades, from the frozen prisons of Siberia to the warm streets of Brooklyn, from Moscow's underworld to America's financial heart. And yet, for all its cruelty, this system of terror had an elegance that law enforcement grudgingly acknowledged. It was clean, efficient, and silent. In the end, the Russian Mafia didn't dominate America through noise or spectacle. It did so through whispers, and the unspoken certainty that behind every whisper there was a gun. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Russian Mafia had become one of the most elusive adversaries in American criminal history. Law enforcement agencies, armed with decades of experience dismantling the Italian Cosa Nostra and Colombian cartels, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that didn't play by any familiar rules. The Russians were everywhere and nowhere, disciplined, multilingual, wealthy, and invisible. They didn't fight for turf, they fought for systems. They didn't sell drugs on street corners. They moved billions through invisible corridors of finance. And when the FBI, DEA, and IRS finally turned their gaze toward them, the realization was sobering. They had already built an empire in plain sight. The first challenge for American authorities was comprehension. In the 1980s, few agents even understood what Russian organized crime truly meant. To many, it was just another immigrant gang problem. But by the 1990s, task forces across New York, Miami, and Los Angeles were overwhelmed by crimes that didn't fit traditional models. Cyber fraud, tax scams, insurance schemes, complex financial operations, and murders with no apparent motive. The criminals spoke Russian, Ukrainian, or Georgian. They used fake identities, and their loyalty was to money, not ethnicity or territory. The FBI's initial approach mirrored the methods that had worked against the Italian Mafia: infiltration, informants, and surveillance. But those tactics failed spectacularly. The Bratva was built on paranoia. Members trusted no one outside their circle, and even inside it, loyalty was enforced through fear, not brotherhood. Informants were rare, and when they did appear, they often vanished permanently. The Russians had learned from decades of KGB observation how to recognize and neutralize surveillance. They conducted meetings in steam baths to avoid wiretaps, used coded language known as fenya, and communicated in handwritten notes that were destroyed after reading. By 1994, the FBI had created its first dedicated Russian organized crime unit based in New York. The mission: to map the networks, identify the key players, and disrupt their operations. But what agents discovered was daunting. The Mafia wasn't one organization, but dozens, connected through fluid alliances stretching from Brooklyn to Moscow, Tel Aviv, Berlin, and Dubai. Each group specialized in something different: extortion, money laundering, cybercrime, arms trafficking, or fraud. But they cooperated when profits aligned. Their leaders were businessmen, not gangsters in the cinematic sense. They wore suits, held investment portfolios, and mingled with politicians and bankers. One of the biggest frustrations for US authorities was jurisdiction. Many of the crimes were transnational, with evidence scattered across countries that refused to cooperate. Russia itself was largely unhelpful. The post-Soviet government, riddled with corruption, often protected or even collaborated with crime figures. Some mobsters held dual roles as businessmen and political donors. Others had direct links to former KGB officers who now occupied influential positions in private intelligence and security firms. When American agents requested extraditions, the paperwork often vanished into bureaucratic limbo. In some cases, witnesses in Russia who agreed to testify simply disappeared. One of the most famous operations to expose Russian organized crime in the US came in 2000, when federal prosecutors charged members of the Solntsevskaya Bratva and their American associates with racketeering, fraud, and extortion. The case, built over years of investigation, relied heavily on financial records and informant testimony. Yet even after dozens of arrests, the results were mixed. Many suspects fled abroad before they could be detained, and those who remained were often released due to insufficient evidence. The problem wasn't the lack of crime, it was the perfection of its concealment. Federal investigators learned that to catch the Russians, they had to think like them. They brought in linguists, cyber specialists, and forensic accountants. They began tracking not the people, but the money, following the invisible trails left behind in offshore accounts, property transactions, and international wire transfers. This new form of warfare was slow, meticulous, and often unrewarding. For every account uncovered, 10 more existed behind layers of secrecy jurisdictions. Meanwhile, as technology advanced, the Russians adapted even faster. By the 2000s, the Bratva had embraced the internet as a weapon. Cybercrime became a new frontier. Phishing scams, ransomware, and credit card theft were industrialized operations, often coordinated from abroad, but targeting American banks and corporations. These digital crimes produced vast profits with minimal risk. The FBI could not simply raid a warehouse or wiretap a phone. The criminals were lines of code operating from another continent. In 2011, a major FBI report titled "The Structure and Scope of Russian Organized Crime in America" concluded that Russian groups had successfully integrated into legitimate industries. They owned construction companies, shipping firms, casinos, and nightclubs. They financed films, sponsored charities, and laundered money through hedge funds. Their strategy was subtle: embed within the system, never challenge it outright. The result was not an invasion, but an infection. The most unnerving discovery came when US intelligence agencies realized that some Russian criminal networks operated in tandem with, or parallel to, Russian state interests. Cyber operations targeting American corporations sometimes overlapped with political hacking campaigns. Arms trafficking intersected with state-sanctioned exports. Money laundering flowed through banks connected to oligarchs who wielded influence in the Kremlin. The distinction between organized crime and geopolitical strategy became impossible to define. For the agents who dedicated their careers to combating Russian organized crime, frustration turned into humility. The old playbook, built on the premise that criminal hierarchies could be dismantled through decapitation, simply didn't apply. You couldn't cut off the head of a hydra when the body stretched across continents. The Russians operated like a decentralized organism, adaptable and self-regenerating. There were victories, of course. High-profile arrests in New York, Miami, and Los Angeles disrupted smuggling rings and exposed billion-dollar frauds. Task forces successfully dismantled some money laundering networks, and key figures were extradited to face trial. But the victories were temporary. Each takedown revealed the same truth: the system survived. Like an ancient code written into the DNA of crime, it adapted and endured. By the 2010s, many US officials began to acknowledge a hard reality: total eradication was impossible. The best law enforcement could hope for was containment, limiting the mafia's reach, disrupting its operations, and tracking its money. As one veteran agent told Frontline in 2015, "You don't destroy the Russian Mafia, you just slow it down." It's not an organization, it's a culture. That culture, born in the prison camps of Stalin's Russia, had evolved through decades of oppression, corruption, and war. In America, it found fertile ground, a capitalist system that rewarded intelligence, adaptability, and the absence of moral limits. The Russian Mafia didn't conquer the United States through violence or infiltration. It conquered it through understanding. It learned the rules of the American dream and turned them inside out. Today, the legacy of that rise remains. Real estate towers, shell corporations, and anonymous bank accounts bear silent testimony to an invisible war that was never truly won. The vori v zakone, the thieves in law, may no longer walk the streets of Brighton Beach with their tattoos and whispered codes, but their spirit endures in the shadows of the global economy. In the end, law enforcement's greatest obstacle was not the Russians' brutality or intelligence. It was their invisibility, their ability to become indistinguishable from the very world they corrupted. They weren't the outsiders America feared. They were the insiders it never noticed. And that, perhaps, is the Russian Mafia's most dangerous victory. Not the money, not the violence, but the silence it left behind.